The morning of July 22, 1999 started the way most mornings did in Yosemite National Park. Pale light filtering through the pines, the sound of the Merced River moving somewhere below the treeline, and the particular stillness that only deep wilderness can hold. For the millions of people who visited Yosemite each year, that stillness was the entire point. It was what they drove hours to feel. A place where nothing bad could reach them. That morning, 36-year-old Dr. Desmond Kidd had just come off a 24-hour shift at the park's medical clinic. He was exhausted, back at his cabin, ready for sleep. Then his pager went off. A missing woman. Law enforcement implications. Something different this time. He got up and drove toward the small hamlet of Forsta. 26-year-old Joey Armstrong had not shown up to visit her friends that weekend. Her white pickup truck was still sitting in the driveway outside her cabin, bags loaded, as if she had been about to leave and simply stopped. Around the vehicle, the scene told its own quiet story. Tire tracks pressed into the earth. A pair of broken sunglasses. A red mechanic's hat left behind. The search team fanned out in 5 groups across the surrounding area. Dr. Kidd and 4 others moved along the banks of Crane Creek, pushing through the undergrowth, reading the ground as they went. Fresh footprints. Trampled ferns. Snapped saplings. The kind of signs that point to someone running rather than wandering. In a narrow ditch filled with 3 feet of standing water, sunlight caught the glint of a clearing just beneath the surface. And then, just beyond it, something else. A woman in a white t-shirt and blue jeans, lying motionless in the water. Dr. Kidd stepped closer and stopped. The full reality of what he was seeing took a moment to process. He turned and ran back to the lead ranger, using the code for a dead body and adding a detail so horrific that it silenced everyone who heard it. Joey Armstrong had been decapitated. For the park, nothing would feel the same after that morning. But to understand how Joey got there, and who put her there, the story has to go back much further. All the way back to a quiet street in Merced, California, and a family that had already survived more loss than most people encounter in a lifetime. On the 4th of December, 1972, 7-year-old Steven Stayner was walking home from school down Yosemite Parkway when a man approached him. Friendly-looking, casually dressed, the man told Steven he wanted to speak to his mother about a church donation. He led the boy to a car where 40-year-old drifter Kenneth Eugene Parnell was waiting behind the wheel. The man beside Steven was a co-worker of Parnell's, described as someone with a limited capacity who had been convinced to help bring a child to him. Steven got in. The car pulled away. At a payphone along the route, Parnell returned to the car and told Steven that his parents no longer wanted him and he would be living with Parnell from now on. Steven believed him. He was gone. The following morning, there was an empty desk in the 2nd grade at Charles Wright School, and an entire family began coming apart at the seams. Steven's parents, Kay and Delbert, threw themselves into the search with the kind of desperate, consuming energy that parents reach for when they have nothing else left. Flyers. Billboards. Psychics. Anything that might lead them back to their son. Kay grew cold and distant as the months stretched on, the weight of not knowing carving something out of her. Delbert grieved openly, and on more than one occasion was found in Steven's room, which had been left exactly as it was, going through his clothes and crying. Steven's older brother Cary, who was 11 at the time, watched all of it from the edges of a house that had stopped being a normal place to live. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. And still nothing. What the Stayner family did not know was that Steven was alive. He was being moved between cabins, trailer parks, and motels as Parnell drifted from place to place. In the early weeks, Steven had been drugged in an attempt to suppress his memories. Over the next 7 years, he was made to call Parnell his father and was subjected to sustained abuse. He was even enrolled in a local school under the name Dennis, and no one there ever pulled his records or made the connection. On the 2nd of March, 1980, Cary Stayner was driving back from a camping trip when a radio bulletin stopped him cold. His 14-year-old brother Steven had escaped his captor and was coming home that afternoon. Cary later said he nearly drove his car off the road. And it was true. Steven was back. He had not only survived but had taken 5-year-old Timmy White with him, a boy who had been abducted just 16 days earlier. Steven had told himself he would not let Timmy endure what he had endured. When the moment came, he took Timmy and ran. The two of them hitchhiked and walked over 40 miles to Ukiah, where Steven walked into a police station and told the officer, "I know my first name is Steven." The street outside the Stayner house filled with news vans. Reporters crowded the doorstep. It was, by every measure, the ending that nobody had dared to believe in. But inside the house, things were harder to read. Steven needed help. Some people around him quietly suggested counseling, but Cary Stayner turned the idea away, insisting it was not necessary. The family tried to settle back into something resembling normal life, but normal no longer had a clear shape. Steven struggled at school. Classmates bullied him because his abuser had been a man, and the cruelty of it wore him down. Parnell eventually went to trial, convicted on kidnapping and false imprisonment, sentenced to 8 years and 8 months, and released after 5. He would go on to attempt the same thing again before dying in prison in 2008. For Cary, Steven's return was supposed to close a wound. Instead, something about it seemed to make things worse. He was born on the 12th of August, 1961, the eldest of 5 children. His father Delbert worked brutal hours during harvest season. His mother Kay ran a daycare and took food service jobs at school cafeterias. The family lived in a small house on Betty Street in Merced, and for a time Cary had been the quiet, unremarkable boy who swam in the backyard pool and played outfield on his baseball team. Shy, reserved, rarely showing much of what went on inside him. When Steven was taken, Cary was 11 years old. He went to school the next day, and the day after that, and kept going. He attended Hoover Intermediate and was placed in a gifted 7th grade class. Later at Merced High, he was known for drawing caricatures of the people around him, turning classmates into exaggerated cartoon figures with a skill that caught everyone's attention. He became the cartoonist for the school paper. Some of the people around him thought he had a real future in front of him. But nobody, it seemed, was paying attention to what was underneath. There is something quietly unbearable about a child growing up in a house hollowed out by grief. Every mealtime carrying the absence of someone who should have been there. Every holiday a reminder. And for Cary, it was compounded by what came after Steven returned. The world erupted in joy for a family that had spent 7 years quietly drowning. Cameras arrived. Attention landed everywhere. And Steven, understandably, became the center of all of it. In footage from that time, as the family gathered in the front yard for a press conference, everyone in the frame was smiling except for one person. Cary stood at the back, stiff, unsmiling. And then he simply walked away. He would later admit to a screenwriter working on a project about the family that his head was all bloated out. That he never really got along with Steven after he came home. That he had been put on the back burner and that he was sure, looking back, he had been jealous. After high school, Cary drifted. Moving furniture. Installing windows. Building shower doors. He cycled through jobs without direction and spent his free time at friends' houses, smoking, watching television, staying on the edges of things. He told a coworker he had been diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder but said he could manage it by using drugs. He briefly dated a few women over the years but nothing lasted, nothing held. In 1990, tragedy reached the family again when police were called to the house Cary shared with his uncle Jerry. Jerry was found dead in the bedroom, killed by a shotgun blast to the chest. Cary was questioned and provided an alibi. He pointed to a homeless man he said had been seen lurking near the property. The lead went cold. The case was never solved. One of his last steady jobs was as a glass cutter. A coworker found him one day repeatedly punching a block of wood until his hand was bleeding. Cary described wanting to drive his truck into the office and kill everyone inside before burning the building down. A friend got him into a psychiatric facility. He received some counseling, went back to pick up his last check, and then never returned to work there again. He mentioned Santa Cruz. He moved on. By the summer of 1997, Cary Stayner had taken a job as a maintenance man at the Cedar Lodge, a motel sitting alongside Highway 140, the road that feeds into Yosemite. He fixed plumbing, set up pool furniture, handled the endless small repairs that kept a busy motel running for its stream of guests. On his days off, he sunbathed naked at secluded spots he knew along the river. He always carried a backpack. Inside that backpack was a gun, duct tape, and a knife. He later called it his murder kit. He began seeing a waitress who worked at the lodge. She had 2 young daughters. The older daughter would later describe the moment as calm, safe exterior started to slip. A day at the river when he stripped off all his clothing in front of her without hesitation and she turned away and walked in the other direction, trying not to acknowledge what had just happened. That discomfort was real and it was telling. What nobody at the lodge knew was that Cary had already chosen a date. February 15, 1999. He had planned to kill his girlfriend and her 2 daughters that day. But when he arrived and saw another person present on the grounds, he understood the plan would not work. So he changed it. That same night, he turned his attention to room 509. Carol Sund was 42 years old and had driven to Yosemite with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's closest friend, 16-year-old Silvina Pelosso, who had traveled all the way from Argentina for the trip. Carol was the kind of person who showed up for others. She attended court hearings as a child advocate, lending her presence and her voice to children who had no one in their corner. She lived to help. Julie had inherited that same drive, always pressing herself to do her best, always reaching. Silvina and Julie had been friends since before they could walk. The 3 of them were having the time of their lives in one of the most beautiful places in the country. After dinner at the Cedar Lodge restaurant on the night of February 15, they went back to their room. At around 11 o'clock, Cary approached room 509 carrying a toolbox packed with rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. He knocked. He told Carol he was the motel handyman and there was a leak in the room above that he needed to check on. Carol looked around the ceiling, saw nothing to suggest a leak, but Cary kept talking, kept pressing, and eventually she let him in. He made small talk. He stepped into the bathroom to keep the pretense going. Then he came out holding a gun and told them not to panic, that he was only there to rob them. He bound them and gagged them with duct tape, moved Silvina and Julie to the bathroom, and then returned to Carol. Without a word, he strangled her with a rope. He took her car keys, dragged her body outside, and loaded it into the trunk of the red Pontiac she had rented. When he went back inside, he sexually assaulted both Julie and Silvina. He then strangled Silvina to death in the bathtub. He left Julie tied up in an adjacent room while he cleaned the scene, then carried her out to the car and placed her in the front seat. She did not yet know that her mother and her best friend were already dead. He drove west through the dark Merced River Canyon, making casual conversation with the terrified girl beside him, with no clear destination in mind. Just before sunrise, he pulled into an empty parking area and carried Julie up a hillside toward the Don Pedro Reservoir. She was shivering and he claimed she asked him to carry her. He would later describe that moment to the FBI in language that revealed something deeply fractured in his sense of reality. He said he had grown fond of Julie. That he wished he could have kept her. Once they reached the overlook, he assaulted her again, brushed her hair back, told her he loved her, and slit her throat. He hid her body in dense underbrush, nearly decapitated, then abandoned the Pontiac off a logging road, walked 2 miles to Sierra Village, and called a taxi. The taxi driver, Jenny, later remembered the weary, disheveled man who had made one unusual comment during the ride. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot. She said no. He told her she should. Because he was real. Back at Cedar Lodge, Cary Stayner reported for work. The search that followed was one of the largest in the history of the area. Hundreds of federal agents, highway patrol officers, and park rangers covered the terrain by foot, helicopter, and dog. For weeks, nothing turned up. Then on March 19, a hiker found the burned-out Pontiac along a remote logging road miles from the lodge. The fire had been so intense it reached the branches of trees 25 feet overhead. In the trunk, investigators found the bound and burned remains of Carol and Silvina. There was no sign of Julie. Some clothing and shoes found near the car kept the faint hope alive that she might have escaped. One item found near the car was a camera. The last photographs on it showed all three of them inside their room at Cedar Lodge on the night they disappeared, relaxed, happy, completely unaware of what was coming. After that, the roll was blank. The fear that moved through Yosemite after that discovery was something the park had never known. Violent crime in that place had always been almost unheard of. People had trusted it completely. Now that trust had broken. Youth group leaders called in asking which trails were safe. Visitors stopped wandering alone and attached themselves to guided tours. At some point during the investigation, one of the female residents at the park mentioned to a maintenance worker how terrible it was that Julie had still not been found. The maintenance man told her he knew that feeling well. His own brother had once gone missing. He said he hoped she would turn up soon. Then a hand-drawn map arrived at the FBI. It showed a trail from Highway 120 leading to the shore of the Don Pedro Reservoir with an X marked on it. A note alongside it read, "We had fun with this one." The search team drove to the location and released a dog. In very little time, it found Julie's son hidden in the dense brush near an overlook, her throat slashed. The man who had drawn that map and sent it to the FBI was Cary Stayner, the maintenance man who had guided the FBI through the crime scene. The man who had sat in the restaurant booth with coworkers discussing the murders as though they were something that had happened to strangers. At first, the investigation had pointed toward two men in Modesto, ex-convicts with violent records named Michael Larwick and Eugene Dykes. The sense of relief when those names emerged was enormous. It felt like it was over. Then Joey Armstrong was found in the ditch by Crane Creek, and everything had to be reconsidered. Joey had grown up in Orlando and had worked her way toward the one job she had always wanted at the Yosemite Institute. She was joyful and creative and entirely herself in that landscape. She took children through the park's backcountry, teaching them about its wildlife, its history, its native plants. She tap danced in hiking boots to make her students laugh. She had written to a friend back in Florida about how much she loved her life there, how much she loved her cabin and the wide meadow full of daisies and the man she shared it with. On the evening of July 21, 1999, Joey had mentioned to colleagues that she was uneasy about spending the night alone, since both her boyfriend Michael and their roommate were away. She began loading her car for the weekend trip to her friends. The car never moved. A worker who had driven past the area that evening remembered seeing a distinctive blue and white 1979 International Scout parked outside Joey's cabin. When the registration records were checked, only two such vehicles existed in the area. One of them belonged to the maintenance man at Cedar Lodge. Two rangers found Cary Stayner sunbathing naked on a riverbank a couple of days after Joey was killed. They seized some marijuana he had on him and let him go. But they held on to the vehicle. Tire track comparisons between the Scout's tires and those found at the crime scene came back as an exact match. 2 days later, Cary was eating lunch at a clothing-optional resort near Sacramento when he was taken into custody. An FBI special agent named Jeffrey Rinnick was the one who finally got him to talk. Over 6 hours in that room, with patience and a carefully built sense of trust, he listened as Cary Stayner confessed to everything. The murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, Silvina Pelosso, and Joey Armstrong. He said he had fantasized about harming women since the age of 7, sitting in his parents' car outside a grocery store, staring through the glass at female employees at the checkout, imagining what it would be like to kill them. He said those thoughts had never stopped. For 30 years he had told no one. He also admitted to writing the letter that led investigators to Julie's body. He said it had bothered him that she was out there in the elements, not being found. There is a question that this case quietly places in front of you, and it is not a comfortable one. At what point do the circumstances of someone's life explain what they became, and at what point do they simply stop explaining it? Cary Stayner grew up inside a family fractured by one of the most traumatic things a family can survive. He watched his parents hollow out. He watched the world obsess over his brother's return and then move on, leaving the whole family to carry something alone that they had never been given the tools to process. Some of those who knew him saw the damage. A neighbor said he thought Steven's kidnapping must have really affected Cary. His own words about jealousy and resentment after Steven came home suggest something unresolved that was never addressed and never spoken about. But none of that explains 4 murders. None of it bridges the distance between a wounded childhood and a toolbox carried to a motel room door. Many people survive broken homes, grief, and neglect without becoming what Cary Stayner became. The darkness in him appears to have been something separate, something that existed in him from very early on and grew in the absence of anyone who might have reached it in time. At trial, the defense presented a psychiatric portrait of a man with mild autism, obsessive-compulsive disorder, paraphilia, a history of hallucinations, and what one doctor described as one of the most extensive psychiatric histories he had encountered. His father Delbert was said to share some of the same traits. His mother Kay struggled with depression. There was also a claim that Cary had been molested as a child, though the identity of the perpetrator was never established. The defense argued that he was too mentally ill to form criminal intent. The prosecution argued the opposite. The planning. The toolbox. The careful staging. The decision to have someone else lick the stamp on the envelope before sending it to the FBI. The return to the abandoned Pontiac days after the murders, where he scratched the fake name Julie had given him into the hood before setting the car on fire. The deliberate drop of Carol's wallet in a Modesto street to redirect the investigation. These were not the actions of someone who had lost contact with reality. They were the actions of someone who understood exactly what he had done and was working methodically to avoid being caught. The jury agreed. Cary Stayner was found sane and convicted of the premeditated murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Pelosso, along with 5 additional felonies including the sexual assaults. He was sentenced to death for those crimes. For the murder of Joey Armstrong, he pleaded guilty in federal court and was sentenced to life in prison. As of the last available information, California had not carried out an execution since 2006, and the automatic appeal process under state law meant his death sentence remained in legal limbo, potentially for years. The families stood in court and tried to find words for what had been done to them. Carol's husband said he knew that Cary had no trouble killing little girls in the middle of the night. Silvina's father had traveled from Argentina with his wife for the trial, and he admitted he had thought about attacking Cary himself in that courtroom. He stood with tears on his face and said there was nothing that could give him his daughter back. That the sorrow was his to carry for the rest of his life. Kay and Delbert Stayner said they had expected the death sentence but asked for mercy, saying their son was sick and had been denied a fair trial. Cary's brother Steven never lived to hear the verdict. On September 16, 1989, riding his motorbike home from his job delivering pizza, a car pulled out in front of him. He was not wearing a helmet. He struck the driver's side door and suffered massive head injuries. The driver fled the scene. Less than an hour later, Steven Stayner died. He was 24 years old. His children were 2 and 3. His wife Jody said she had never been so angry in her life. His parents were on a camping trip when it happened. Friends found them to deliver the news. His mother had held herself together for 7 years of not knowing where her son was. This broke her. The television movie based on Steven's abduction had been nominated for 4 Emmy Awards. Steven was killed the day before the ceremony. A statue was later placed in Applegate Park in Merced in Steven's memory, dedicated to his heroism and the extraordinary act of a 14-year-old boy who chose to take a 5-year-old stranger with him when he ran toward freedom. Joey Armstrong's memory was honored in a different way. A scholarship founded in her name was created to support young women and give them the tools to pursue their ambitions. Carol Sund had devoted her life to being a voice for those who had none. Julie Sund was 15 years old with everything still ahead of her. Silvina Pelosso had come from Argentina full of trust and curiosity and the kind of openness that makes the world feel generous. Joey Armstrong had found her place in one of the most extraordinary landscapes in the country and she was exactly where she wanted to be. All four of them were in places they should have been safe. All four of them were let down by the same thing. Not the wilderness. Not the park. A man who had been carrying something terrible inside him for decades, moving quietly through the world, holding a door open, offering directions, sitting in a restaurant booth talking about the news, and never once letting anyone see what was actually there. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of all of it. Not the violence itself, but the ordinariness that surrounded it. The coworkers who said he never raised his voice. The teenagers who saw him every day and felt completely at ease. The FBI agents who interviewed him twice and walked away without a second thought. Some things stay hidden for a very long time,